Okay, we yanked out the motherboard before, and now that we've got it out, let's take a good close look at it. Why do you care? Well, you care because you might replace any of a number of things here, first of all. And second of all, sometimes you just got to find this stuff. So this is a pretty generic ATX motherboard. You're going to find that most clone motherboards are going to be laid out something like this. So once you get the feel for how this one's laid out, it'll be relatively easy to find other things. I want to start out over on this piece here. And up in this corner, you notice that we've got a sort of an older, traditional-looking chip, kind of long rectangular chip. The technical phrase for this kind of chip is called a DIP, dual inline pin chip. Notice also that it's sitting in a socket, which is kind of odd these days. Most things aren't sitting in sockets. The reason is that is a little computer all in itself. Yes, believe it or not, it's a CPU and some memory and some read-only memory. That is some never changes memory that's got a little program in it. Well, what are you doing with a computer all in itself on your motherboard? What that is your keyboard controller. Believe it or not, you've got an entire standalone computer whose only job it is to keep track of your keyboard. Now, the reason that it's socketed is that once in a while, the program that's in there becomes out of date for some reason. I haven't seen this in a few years, but I do recall that when OS 2 came out, there was a need to yank the keyboard controllers on a number of motherboards and replace them with these new chips. What did they cost? Well, sometimes the manufacturer will give them to you for nothing. Sometimes, however, it costs extra money. In any case, taking them out is really straightforward. You're probably going to use a flat screwdriver like this. You just get in underneath and pry it up just a bit. I'm not going to do it. And then pry it up over on this side a little bit and go back and forth about 3 or 4 times till it gets loose. Again, be sure you've got your anti-static wrist strap on before you do any of that. Another thing that you might end up working with, probably higher probability than your keyboard controller, is your battery. System's got a battery. One of these little coin batteries is typically what you see on motherboards. Although, to tell you the truth, many of us probably will never change a motherboard battery because they're good for about 3, maybe 4 years, and by that time it's time for a new computer, isn't it? But in any case, changing a coin battery is just straightforward. It pops right out. The one thing to be absolutely sure of is that if you put the battery in backwards, you could well damage the motherboard. I was going to say I did it. A friend of mine. No, I did it. I blew a motherboard once by putting one of these coin batteries in backwards. These little connectors over here, you may not recall, but these are the ones that I warned you about when we were taking the system apart. And I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm trying to keep you from doing the dumb things that I've done when I've taken systems apart. These are those little pins that stand up so that all those little connectors for the lights, the switches, etc. have a place to go. This is the chip that says energy on it. That's one of the motherboard support chips. Moving over this way, I've got these long black plastic things, 4 of them. These are called ISA, or Industry Standard Architecture slots. These are we're going to talk a little bit more about them later, but basically these are a place to put older kinds of boards. Newer sorts of boards go into one of these 3 white slots called PCI. Was it Peripheral Component Interconnect, not a particularly good acronym. In any case, PCI slots are used for the more modern stuff, and there's one slot that's all by itself here. You're only going to have one of them. It's this little brown one, and that's called an AGP, Advanced Graphics Processor slot. And that's where your video board is going to be for many systems. Again, we'll talk about AGP a little bit later, but that's kind of a start there. And then if we come around and take a different look at the motherboard here, I want to show you this side of the motherboard. And to that end, I've got a couple of connectors here I want to look at, and I've got these guys sticking up I want to look at. So those are the things I'll focus on over here. Now, what exactly are these guys? Well, these, if you look closely, you can't see it in the video, but trust me, there are 40 little pins sticking up inside a box here, and 40 little pins sticking up inside a box here as well. Those are the IDE, or more technically eIDE interface channels. There's going to be 2 of them on most modern motherboards, as I mentioned when we were taking the motherboard apart. One of them is going to be called the primary channel, one will be called the secondary channel, and off the top of my head, can I see which one is which? Some motherboards label it, some do not. It's nice if you can find one that labels it, and I'm looking here, and it doesn't say. But many motherboards will come with a diagram. And if worst comes to worst, if you're trying to figure out which is primary and which is secondary, if you only have one drive, plug it into one channel, turn it on. If the system sees a drive in the primary channel, bingo, you won. You know, if not, switch the cable around. Now these other little guys that are standing up here, these are your memories. And you're going to see a little later, we're going to talk about different kinds of memories, but this is the modern kind you're going to find on most systems, most clones. These are memory modules, and these memory modules are things, I used to say about the size of a stick of gum, but I guess they're the size of the jumbo gum at this point. In any case, these memory modules go in relatively easily and allow you to expand memory. The main problem you run into is that nowadays, most motherboards that are out there will only accommodate perhaps 500 megabytes or 768 megabytes of memory. And I hear you laughing, saying, am I going to need 768 megabytes of RAM, Mark? I mean, good Lord, I've got 32 megs or 64 megs now. And the answer is, yes, you will. Here's the reason why. Have you noticed that Microsoft tends to write software that can exploit the maximum amount of hardware that's out there? Sometimes people say that Microsoft writes checks that Intel has to cash, or as some people would say, Intel giveth and Microsoft taketh away. In any case, you got to figure that if you want to buy a computer now and have that computer be viable, be useful for the next 3-4 years, I mean, do you really want to buy a new computer every year? I don't. I would make sure that it could easily expand to at least 512 megabytes of memory. So many of these guys will only go to 512. It would be nicer if they could take it further to 4 gigabytes of memory or something like that. The Xeon systems will do that. As I mentioned before, the Xeon's the more expensive version of the Pentium 2. It's just not a great answer there, unfortunately. I got no choice. That's that section. Let's come over here and take a peek over on this quadrant of this motherboard, rather. And there's some neat stuff to see here. First of all, there's sticking up is the big black plastic module, which I have referred to before. You've already met that. That's our CPU. And once again, notice the CPU just slides right into its nice little slot there, and it will come out quite easily. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. Until recently, we had to do some real gyrations in order to get a CPU to go into a slot with lots and lots of pins. It was nasty. And typically, you'll find a fan connection as well. Goes into that Bird connector we mentioned before. Sitting over here also is another one of those connectors that looks like it might be that IDE connector. But if you were to count the pins, trust me on this, if you were to count the pins, you'd see the 34 pins rather than 40 pins. That's the floppy connector. Back over here are all of our connections to the outside world. And it wasn't that long ago that you'd have to put separate boards in your system to get these outside connections. But now it's very convenient, and it's right there waiting for us. As soon as you plop in a motherboard, you have a keyboard and mouse connector. And for those of you that are just setting up your first system in a few years, that might be a surprise, because keyboard connectors used to look like this, round, but they used to be bigger. Now we've got the mouse and the keyboard look the same, and which means you sometimes have to be a little careful. It's easy to plug in one where if you've plugged in the mouse and the keyboard and turned the computer on and the keyboard doesn't respond and the mouse doesn't respond, turn it off and swap the connections around and you'll be fine. We have what should be familiar for those who have been using PCs for a while. You see this connector here. This is a D shell. It's called a D shell connector. Why? Because if you look at it like this, well, come on, play along. If you look at it like this, then it kind of looks like a D. And they're either called DB9 because it's got 9 pins, and you'll see male or female. In this particular case, it's got the pins, so this is a DB9 male, and you know that's a serial connector. Serial, also known as RS-232, or COM1 or COM2. The things you'd attach to that would be a modem, perhaps an attachment for a cradle for a Palm Pilot. Many digital cameras will connect to the computer and allow you to download the pictures using a serial port. Serial ports are kind of your nice, all-purpose, very useful ports, but the problem is that they're too overworked. Most of us find we need more than 2 serial ports. And it's a pain in the neck to add a 3rd serial port. You can do it, but you won't like it, trust me. So that's why we have this other newer kind of connection, this newer kind of connection here. One of these little guys. These are called, actually there's 2 of them here. These are called Universal Serial Bus or USB connectors. And the whole theory with USB, which you're going to meet a little later, is that USB is a thing like a serial port, very much like a serial port, except it can be daisy-chained or extended with hubs so that one USB connector can support up to 127 different devices, or 63 devices, depending on which chipset your motherboard is built around. And the speed's pretty good. We're talking about over 10 million bits per second. So we can do some very, very cool stuff with it. 2 problems with USB. The first problem is your operating system probably doesn't support it. Windows 95 in general does not support it. The latest version of 95 did, but most of us don't have that. Windows 98 does support it. NT4 does not support it. Windows 2000 does support it. So if you've got a relatively new operating system, chances are good you've got USB support. Otherwise, no go. That's the first problem. The second problem is that you need something to plug into USB. There are some peripherals that attach to USB, some cameras, some video cameras, the video conferencing cameras, some keyboards, some mice, some scanners, but not a really huge and wide variety yet. That's changing with time. So we've seen the connectors, the floppy connector, CPU. There was a power connector. I guess I should bring that back over here. Forgot to point that out for you. There's a power connector right there by the CPU. We saw the memory. We saw the IDE connectors, the battery, keyboard connector, slots, and that's about all there is to a motherboard.